Hello there everyone, how are you all doing?
Hello.
So you're very welcome, pleasure to be chatting to you here today. So if you've come to hear a little bit more about making a stick, you're very welcome. If you've come just because you need a little bit of a rest or a snooze post-lunch, you're very welcome as well. I'll give you a nod when it's time to laugh at my terrible gags. So my name is Carl Daly. I'm from Corn Ferry Hay Group, and basically I'm looking to talk to you guys today very much around how to make learning development stick, particularly around what are some of the trends in learning that we're seeing, and also those then within the context of technology, of course. A few things. My background is in leadership and talent, so I've been working in this area for about 15 years, and for me one of the biggest frustrations I have is in terms of any sort of learning or development opportunity where you do some fantastic stuff and people go back to work and it gets no traction. And this is a challenge and I know a frustration that's shared by a lot of my clients and a lot of my colleagues as well. So it's an area of real interest to me. How do you actually get people to get back into work and embed learning? And that's what I want to chat to you about today. A few things I want to mention as well. I mean, technology in of itself is fantastic. If you've been walking around here today, there's some incredible stuff. I would pose the question though sometimes is, do we sometimes jump into technology for the sake of technology? And do we lose sight maybe of what we're actually trying to do? So I do want to take a bit of a step back. I'm going to do two things. I'm going to start with a bit of context around the world we're operating in first. And then I want to get actually into, before talking about technology specifically, what are some of the trends we're seeing in learning itself? And then how does technology support that? Sound okay? In the right theatre? Do you need to leave? Good stuff. Okay, so I want to frame the first example around a real example. I was having lunch with a client of mine recently. She's head of a leadership and talent business in an oil and gas company. I'm going to call her Jane for the purposes of this. That's not a real name. But Jane was chatting to me about the challenges of developing leaders in the business. So basically in terms of how do you get traction, how do you get buy-in from the business as well, in terms of investing in the future pipeline of leaders. This is a challenge that's shared, I think, across organizations. And she was talking very much around, what are the things we need to have in place, how do we make sure the external pressures aren't blocking us from doing that. And that's kind of, a legacy thing that I hear from a lot of people. If you think about looking at this from the past, present, and future, this is this kind of ongoing challenge Jane's had. We went on to talk about issues that she's facing specifically in the industry. Oil and gas, the price of oil has plummeted massively for any people who are aware of the industry. Even if you're not, I don't think you can miss that. So that's facing a big external pressure on her and budget and focus around learning and development. And I've captured that under the concept VUCA. People hear this VUCA acronym, I think it's coming out more and more. So it's the idea that the world we live in is more volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous than ever before. The acronym was actually coined post the Cold War to talk about how after that there was so much confusion and uncertainty, it led to a lot of people feeling, where are we going in the world? But since the 90s, a lot of business thinkers and leaders have started coining this to say, with technology for one thing, there's so much stuff pushing and the pace of change is so fast that it's very difficult to actually make plans. Even strategies, which used to be 3 to 5 years, are now changing in the space of 6 months to a year. So for Jane, this was a big piece that how do we kind of maintain leadership and learning and development in this context. She's also a very future-focused person. I've started thinking about, how do we make sure we're future-proofing anything we do around any sort of technology, learning, interventions, etc. And I've captured this under the idea of megatrends. And again, this is a big area. There's a lot of thinking and research around this if you Google it. Some colleagues of ours recently released a book on this, Leadership 2030, which talks about where are we going as a planet, as a people, and what does that mean for organizations, and what does it mean for leadership and learning. And some of the key concepts of this, and you can tell it was put together by psychologists because they like to use big words. Globalization, of course. So this is the idea that the world's becoming a much smaller place through technology, through immigration, through more global organizations. Individualism and value pluralism is about the fact that people are expecting more and they're expecting things to be tailored to them. And again, technology influences this. If you go onto Google, it'll already tell me how many things I should be buying based on previous searches. But that's actually perpetrating into organizations that people say, actually, I'm valuable as an individual as well. And people's values are coming in. Work-life balance, flexibility, expressing yourself in work. This was never the case before. but this is becoming more and more consistent with what we see. Digitization, we're always on. We've all got our smartphones with us. In terms of mobile working, this is a big trend as well. Demographic change, as I mentioned, if you look at workforces these days, they're very different to what they ever were before. The population in terms of workforce is getting, it's aging as well. We're seeing more kind of diversity, and you're seeing a lot more kind of a mix of people within teams, and also global diversity. And then in terms of technology convergence, well, if you've walked around here, you can see the kind of impact this is having. So, back to Jane, I think there's a lot of factors that are playing in here that makes it quite challenging. And actually, in terms of thinking about developing leaders, developing ourselves, developing anyone, these are important things to bear in mind. And for me, it's something that I always need to sense check myself, because I get so excited about learning interventions and doing different things that you can lose sight of the context and how we're future-proofing where we're going. Does that make sense? Good stuff. So I've covered kind of 3 areas there in terms of some of the kind of background context trends. I'm going to keep that consistency going. I'm going to talk about 3 key trends in learning, and then 3 key trends around technology. So as an Irishman, it's a bit of a difficult thing to say in terms of 3 over and over again, because we can't pronounce it very well. But stick with me, and no one to blame but myself. So, talking about learning trends, okay, and these are trends, they're not fads. These are things, if you do any kind of research in the area, there's a lot of thinking, there's a lot of documentation around these different types of areas. So these aren't fads, this is the way people are learning and will continue to do so as we move on. First point, personal aspirations. This leads to that idea of individualization. So how are things being tailored to people? I know when I learn, I like to know how it's relevant to me and the context that I work in. And I think this is the piece that people often miss, is how do you actually engage people to say this is why this is relevant to you, your world, and the challenges you face in business or in personal life. So that's always a big starting point for me, is how do you tap into people's personal ambitions and make it real for them. The second piece is around different learning styles. This is an interesting one in terms of how this links to technology. 2 parts of this. One is we all learn in different ways, we've got different preferences. So again, if I asked everyone in this theatre, when you first got your last smartphone, did you just take it out and start playing with it? Or did you read the instruction manual back to back? That influences kind of how we like to do things. And technology is allowing us to tap into that a lot more than we used to. Because previously, if you think of a classroom setting, it's quite difficult to maybe get everything right for everyone all the time. But now with technology and people getting access to information, we can start doing this. The other piece for me is around, for anyone who's familiar with David Kolb and his work, he talks about, a few nods in the crowd, if you take people through the full learning cycle, that embeds learning a lot better. So what I mean by that is, some time to reflect, some time to observe, some time to practice, and then sometimes to go through that loop again. So that's a factor that will play in later on to some of the technology pieces I mentioned. And these are some flags. It's very easy to miss these things. You say, we've got this fantastic new learning management system. Everyone go through it. Okay, well, how does that talk into making sure people apply that learning and can come back and test it? So just a sense check there. And the last people I've called empowering through learning. So this is kind of essentially, people are more and more wanting the flexibility to learn at their own pace and at their own time. And this is really, really a strong learning trend that we're seeing time and time again. I noticed earlier on, Beyond Maturity were here in a stance. Their organisation did a lot of interesting research proposals. And they did a piece of work which said that 88% of people who were surveyed want to learn their own time. So that's quite significant. And prior to some of the technological advances coming along, that wasn't really possible. I'm going to Mexico in a few weeks, so I'm trying to learn Spanish again. And the only time to do it is to commute to work. So if you've been on the tube when I had my kind of Spanish books out, I'd probably be thrown out at the next stop. So, podcasts and various things have been really helping with that. So there's some of the key points around actually making it personal, and I'll kind of loop back to that in a little bit. The next key learning trend I want to talk about is essentially kind of learning in bite-sized chunks. And this really talks around the main proposition that learning is not a single event, it's a process that happens over time. So again, a lot of those experiences I've had is you have a great, fantastic learning, whatever it is, MOOC or a face-to-face session. People go away and they go, right, now go back to work and apply that. Learning takes time, it takes practice, it takes trying things out. And so it needs to happen over time. And this idea of learning trends and bite-sized learning is really kind of facilitating this. Essentially, the thinking is learning in small chunks makes it a daily activity, and it means that you can embed this a lot more. So rather than trying to learn a huge amount of information in one go, how do you kind of spread that out and do it in short, sharp bites? And yeah, if we think about the different devices we have available to us through iPads and smartphones, this is a lot more accessible than it used to be. The last piece around kind of snackable content, what I essentially mean here is that by using kind of short, sharp ways to access information and to convert theory and learning into these, you can do much more interesting things. So you can make it a lot more engaging, you can use a lot more different kind of techniques that will tap into people's interest and actually how we like to learn. So there's some interesting things that we look at very much around, if you think of advertisements, these have to be short and sharp. Radio advertisements, television advertisements, they have to be short and sharp because of basically the time they have to get a message across. But they can often get a message across in such a way that it's so memorable that you can't get it out of your head maybe. So if people are familiar with the Go Compare guy, the Go Compare, that guy, I hate him. I hate that guy, but if I need to get car insurance, I probably know where I'm going to punch into Google. However, that's not the most engaging example, but using techniques like this actually makes it a lot more easy for people to take in information. This actually talks to the neuroscience of our brain. So using things like storytelling, visuals, music, actually affects our brain at a different level. It talks to the limbic system, which is all about feeling and actually been proven to help you retain information more effectively, rather than kind of typically what we see is, data and facts, which talk to kind of different part of the brain, the kind of prefrontal cortex. I won't get into a big neuroscience debate here, don't worry. But it actually affects on that level. Are people familiar with, there's a great TED talk by Simon Sinek, The Golden Circle. A lot of people know it. If you don't, check it out. It's fantastic in terms of information around how different things affect the brain, storytelling, etc. But again, the other thing is our attention spans are getting shorter. I was tagged on something on Facebook there recently. It was a video a friend of mine sent me. I clicked on it, 7 minutes, too long. I don't have time for that in my life, 7 minutes. What happened there? I don't know. I used to be a very patient person, and now 7 minutes seems too long to me. Speaking of which, that Simon Sinek clip, there's a 20-minute version and a 5-minute version for people like me who just aren't patient. Talking about the new generations, millennials as well, have kind of grown up with this. So actually, anything that's too long, particularly around learning, disengages people. So short, sharp, punchy stuff is really making the difference. It's interesting, last weekend I had to put up some shelves in my house. I know people are like, where's he going with this? But essentially, I'm kind of the background of kind of assembly for idiots, IKEA instruction thing. YouTube to the rescue, so different formats being able to tap into, had a step-by-step guide in terms of how to put up these shelves. And the interesting thing about any of these aspects is that it actually engages you and motivates you more when you see it apply in real life. So I was able to kind of, I put up these shelves, kind of did the classic man for a good 20 minutes, kind of feeling very proud of myself. But the truth was I was very engaged, very motivated, and I'll learn how to do that more effectively, because back to the learning styles, I was able to apply that learning immediately. Does that make sense? I'll come back to talk about that in a little bit more detail when I talk about just in time. But that's essentially snackable content. What are we talking about there? Next key area, 70-20-10. People probably know this. A few smiles, yep, familiar with this guy. So for anyone who doesn't, this is the idea that for learning to truly be embedded, the balance should look like this. And that is 10%, only 10% should be around formal training, whether that's classroom learning or online learning, whatever that is. But actually where the true embedding of learning back in the workplace or wherever it is comes from 20% coaching and mentoring, and amazing 70% on the job application. So again, back to me putting up the shelves, that was kind of the 70% of actually trying it out, seeing what went well, and then coming back. A lot of organizations think they're doing this well, but either they're focusing too much here or they're doing the other two in unhelpful ways. And what I mean by that is they're thinking, okay, we need to do coaching. Send some coaches out. It tends to be quite directive. Yeah, it tends to be quite directive. We're not really, again, personally focused on the individual and what their needs are. So technology again links into this in some beautiful ways. In terms of the kind of 20%, even things like virtual coaching works very well. I'll talk about an app later on that we call an app in your pocket. It's a coach in your pocket essentially, which can give you, in the best possible way, ways to kind of remind yourself of different objectives you're supposed to be tapping into, give you reminders, tips, and all these kind of good things. And certainly the 70%, there's a challenge with this. Because if you learn something and want to apply it back in the workplace, there's a bit of a risk here. There's a bit of exposure in terms of, I'm not going to try something totally different and new when I need to be kind of delivering numbers at the end of the month or whatever you're doing. So things like simulations, gamification are really helpful here because they're creating that bridge between learning and applying it back in the workplace, and it's creating a safe environment to do this. So 70-20-10, it's been around for a while. But I think, again, proper application of this, there's nothing better. And particularly when we think of technology, this is, I think, kind of been given a new life. Am I making sense so far, folks? Yeah. Yeah, good stuff. Okay. So, now on to my trio of areas around the technology space. So, suppose very familiar topics here. But I want to link these back to some of the areas I've already been chatting about. So, first of all, I want to talk about just-in-time learning. So this links back to the piece around the kind of snackable content and 70-20-10 actually. So just-in-time learning is essentially around learning just in time rather than just in case. So what I mean by that is learning something specifically when you need it, my shelves, rather than learning lots and lots of stuff in case in time you might need it. Okay, so there's a new kind of, school of thought around this, is that, well, is it helpful to kind of, for me to have gone on a DIY course 6 months ago when I would have been like, I can't really remember any of that, to be honest. And it's the idea of, like, if people need to learn something, give it to them just in time. And then the idea of this snackable content, TED Talks, YouTube, e-learning, all this stuff really, really facilitates this. So I think as an enabler, this is fantastic stuff. And that's kind of a personal thing for me, that I think some of the technology advances are phenomenal. But I do still believe it's a great enabler of learning rather than a driver of it. And I'll welcome some challenge on that. Well, I'll be at stall T17 later if you want to come and give out to me or anything. So that's just-in-time learning, and I think really helps with a lot of different ways. So, other piece, big one around simulation and gamification. So I've seen a lot of kind of cool stuff around here already today around different aspects of gamification. Last one. Sorry, there's a lot of mic there. There we go. So simulation is an interesting one. It talks to this idea of 70-20-10, and essentially it's that simulation is a great way to apply learning in a safe environment. So back to what I was talking around earlier on, is how do you create the bridge between learning and application, but people don't feel exposed or at risk to do that. And simulation can also act as a great way to practice stuff once you've learned something. So that's another danger. Once we go back into the workplace, how do we actually keep trying things out and doing different things? And obviously gamification is the biggest buzzword probably of all at the moment, certainly what I'm hearing, in terms of new and interesting things to make this simulation come alive. Simulation traditionally, in terms of stuff I was involved in, was very much around using actors, using actually recreating actual real-life scenarios. But now with gamification and different technology, you can recreate this in a much more accessible way. And not to say the other stuff isn't fantastic, it is, but now we've got a lot more freedom and options around this. There's an interesting piece, I think, for me, also around the idea that game theory is something that has been tested time and time again, and it actually plays to a lot of the way our brains work. So if you think of like our natural non-conscious motives, sorry, another bit of psychobabble for you, essentially it taps into this and it makes it addictive for us. So things like the need to achieve, this is like actually this is like a hunger motive. It drives your behavior. So that need to achieve things, the need to influence people, is another thing that makes it addictive and helps people focus more in on it. I presume a lot of people know Candy Crush. So, I read a statistic recently that 93 million people play Candy Crush over 1 billion times a day. I've never played it. I'm a little bit scared to play it because the amount of people I see missing their trains and bus stops and various things because I need to get to the next level. But it just shows how addictive these concepts are, and when that's applied to a learning concept framework, very powerful stuff. And this isn't a new thing. Even if you think of the concepts of Sudoku and crosswords as paper-based puzzles, these have always been shown to help with cognitive function and are a more engaging way to learn. So again, gamification, it's good, it works. There's neuropsychology to back it up. The other interesting thing about gamification is around the talent life cycle. So I know, for example, Deloitte used this in their recruitment now, in terms of assessing graduates to come in. It's used a huge amount in development, and I'll talk to you an example of that and I'll show you that in a minute. So we're seeing more and more of this pop into the whole talent life cycle, and I think that's only going to continue. I do have a health warning around this, I think, so I've seen some really fantastic stuff around gamification, and what often you see is that this looks great. You know, the visuals are cool, it's very slick, and when you lift up the hood, what's behind it? Okay, so I think there's always a sense check to me to say, is this driving people to a purpose? Is there a learning here? How is it helpful? So I guess that's something I sometimes see that looks great, but actually what's underneath the hood, which links to that point of, and I'm the biggest culprit of this, getting carried away with technology and exciting things. I'm like, I want to have a go. But you know what I mean? Before we do that, does this actually work? So I want to give you an example of something we've done at Korn Ferry Hay Group. My first plug of the day, 20 minutes in, I think I'm doing pretty well. But basically what we did is we wanted to look to develop a simulation around some of our core IP. And so we worked with an organization called OSOSIM, who are leaders in this area, because what they do is they create gamification that's based on artificial intelligence. So what you often see is a lot of gamification is kind of, they present you kind of, here's a scenario, here's 3 options, what do you do, let's move on to the next scenario. Whereas with this new technology around simulation, what you're doing is essentially every decision you make or don't make totally changes the landscape of the simulation. So it makes it feel a lot more realistic to a real life challenge to say, well, if I do this, that's going to change everything else. So essentially the simulation almost thinks for itself, and basically it's a very adaptive type of technology. So we were very interested in that. What we brought to the table was 60 years of intellectual property around leadership impact, and we brought those 2 areas together. And essentially what we did is we created what we call the Leadership Live simulation. And I'll kind of play it here in the background so you can have a go. And the thinking here was that we wanted something that was engaging and exciting. What you're basically doing is you're a team leader of 6 different geographies across the world, setting up global rock concerts for a charity. But behind this, what we've pumped into it is 60 years of research and application of our tools around leadership and impact. So in terms of people using this, what will typically happen is you'll go through a development program and you get feedback from your teams, the real people you work with, around the leadership styles you demonstrate and the impact you have. And then the challenge we often see is people are going to go, okay, what do I need to do differently? And this creates the bridge to try things out in a safe environment. So what you can do is you go on the simulation, your feedback might say, look, you're a little bit directive, you're kind of telling us what to do rather than being a bit more visionary and coaching. And you go into a simulation and you try that out. So it helps you bridge that point between learning and application. The simulation also gives you feedback in the same format as you get from your team. So you can consolidate those together and say, well, what am I doing different? Or am I doing anything different? The other cool thing is a lot of people use this after they've been through an intervention, so they can practice time and time again. And because of the nature of the technology, you can run this 50 times, and each time you'll get a different output. So we're very excited and proud about this. You should come along to T17, it's down there. Not only are there cookies and various other cool things, you can actually try this out. So it's something we're very, very proud of. There's nothing else out there like this at the moment. So please come down, and we can even set you up with demos to take away and various other things. But again, it's that idea of how do you bring this kind of technology around simulation together with real research-based proven techniques. So that's the Leadership Live simulation, and this is, you have lots of meetings. People call you as well. I designed half this, and I still get frustrated with one of the characters, and they keep calling you over and over again. And if you don't answer, they keep calling you again and again. So, quite like real life. Okay. Next area I want to talk about is essentially around mobile learning and virtual learning. So a lot of people might know some of these areas, particularly around the idea of apps, podcasts, all those different things we can do. Seemingly we look at our mobile phones 150 times a day when we don't even have a message. It's a genuine statistic. So obviously this is a huge area that's only going to continue more and more in relation to how we apply this to learning. So a few different things that I've seen. One example is the Commonwealth Bank of Australia have introduced an app called Sidekick. I'm sure people have heard of this. Basically 10,000 of their employees are on it, and it covers everything from literally onboarding to accessing different colleagues, to getting your pay slip, to doing all sorts of cool stuff. And seemingly it's reduced requests on HR by 50%, which allows them not only to track information about their people, but it frees them up to say, well, how do we make the kind of, the employee experience even better? We have our own apps as well. This is plug number 2. There'll be 3 of them in the same system of keeping it in 3s. Around our own apps. So we've got apps that kind of talk to each of our different service lines. One about that leadership style and impact piece as well. So you can zap the QR code, and essentially the coach in your pocket will give you tips. It'll remind you, don't forget, you need to have a team meeting this week, don't forget, Tanya likes a little bit more of a different approach than that person, and kind of reinforces some of these teachings over time when it's very easy to get, you go back to work and you get consumed by the day job. Another journey app for graduates helps people in terms of the softer skills, which we often find graduates aren't missing when they come straight into work. They're trying to apply technical skills very quickly, missing some of the more emotional intelligence side of things, shall we say. Another interesting stat I saw was that a lot of applicant tracking companies are showing that 45% of candidates now apply for jobs on their mobiles. So our world is becoming all about our smartphones. We all have one, with the possible exception of my mother in Dublin, who refuses to accept one. The other area I want to talk about is virtual learning and telepresence suites. I had my first experience of one of these recently, where it was literally like you're sitting in the room with people, but I was here, they were in Texas. So much so a colleague of mine had to go behind the screen just to double check there wasn't some sort of kind of Wizard of Oz thing going on. And Adobe Connect, are people familiar with this system? So I'll play one in the background just so you can see it. So basically it's positioned kind of as a dynamic shared platform online. So if this was a real scenario, this individual would be live, it's not pre-recorded. And basically this allows access to a lot of different areas. So we work with a global bank, we work with their middle managers, and the challenge they have is they can't be flying people around, just purely in terms of budget, but they want to get them some sort of development exposure, and this is the way we do it. Run classrooms using this technology. You can do all sorts of cool stuff in terms of breakout rooms, kind of pods, chat pods, surveys, and all sorts of good stuff. The other area was with another oil and gas company, where a lot of their employees are working offshore, but they don't want to kind of exclude them from having chances to get some exposure to learning. So this is kind of in terms of a live classroom, does some great stuff, and it's something we're feeding into a lot more of our programs as the days go on. So some really cool stuff, and then I'm seeing some of the stalls here. Conscious I've got 5 minutes to go, so I'm going to speed up a little bit here. I guess just in closing, a few points that I just kind of reiterate for me, from my experience working with learning and technology. And it's the kind of bringing together the people side of things with technology. And I think that was what I emphasize. Don't forget the people side of it. And the first point, again, is making it real for individuals. Again, we did another piece of work with the global bank. They put this amazing learning management system together that had all sorts of MOOCs and learning modules and every kind of bell and whistle that you wanted. And they launched this thing that said, this is what it does, and it has all these options, and you can do this, and you can do that, it's fantastic. It didn't get much traction. And the reason being, no one really knew what it was, but they didn't know why they should use it, or how it was relevant for them in their role, or in terms of actually the organizational objectives. This is a big danger here. We miss the kind of why and the what and the how when we're kind of driving technology and new ways of doing things. Again, that's Simon Sinek TED Talk. Very cool about talking around stuff like that. The other piece for me is around, is technology replacing the need to have people there? I'm a firm believer that people still need to be there, and it's the bringing together of these two that makes the difference. There's a lot of technology, yes, that is replacing certain aspects of what we do, but do I believe technology can replace a mentoring session, translating strategy, communicating a compelling vision? For me, I don't think it's the case. I haven't been to every stand here though, so maybe there is some sort of Obama 3000 vision machine that I haven't seen yet. But I think it's a key point for me. The best interventions I've seen with technology have also included the people side of things. One other project we ran a few years back, we put 6,000 nurses and midwives through a development program in the space of just over a year. And we had to rely a lot on technology, and we applied a lot of these techniques, the self-directed learning, short, sharp videos, nothing longer than 5 minutes. Because a lot of these professionals are on the ground, they're in wards, they're in people's houses, they can't be taking time out. They loved it in a number of ways. One, it empowered them with the learning. Two, that when they did come to face-to-face sessions, everyone was at the same level in terms of learning. Because you might watch a video 100 times, I might watch it 200 times to get it into my head, depending on what your learning preferences is. And the third part is when we brought people together, we weren't introducing new concepts. What we were doing is processing the learning, discussing it, trying things out. And that, I think, was the most powerful piece for people, that actually when we were getting people, we weren't going through 100 slides. We were actually kind of, bringing that to life. So I think that for me, if anything, is the closing point is that, technology is incredible, it's fantastic, but it's only as good as the application and how people are being used and how they understand why it means something to them. I'm going to do 3 plugs. So just before I finish, I'm going to do the very last one. We recently delivered our own program that designed it based on some of these concepts. So there's the kind of summary of what I've talked about. We developed a program based on leadership styles and impact. And that's for matrix leaders, traditional leaders, etc. And against each of these areas, we wanted to kind of factor in some of these concepts. So for example, in terms of making it personal, we built a lot of exercises around starting with the why. What about your individual context? What's your team all about? What is your job there to achieve? And what's the strategy? We did actual sessions on strategy itself. How do you translate that for your teams? And gave people individual feedback before doing anything else. In terms of the second piece, which is around bite-sized learning, a similar approach to that work we did with the nurses and midwives, converted as much of the learning as possible to online content, videos, cartoons, silent movies. Stuff that's engaging, a bit of fun that tells a story, and people loved it. We also did stuff on storytelling, got people to tell their own stories. So instead of telling someone your experience in a very technical way, tell it through a story. Sounds a bit cheesy, but works really well. In terms of actually then the kind of 70-20-10, we do a lot of stuff in actually bringing people together. Peer coaching, individual feedback, action learning sets, the simulation of course, and then technology, we have the option of using these virtual classrooms, we have the apps and the learning simulation. So that's my last plug, number 3. So folks, I think we're up to the 30 minutes. T17, it's kind of sugar time. We've got cookies there, you can actually try the simulation, you can try the apps. I'll be there, whether that's a good or bad thing, to answer any questions or challenges you have, as will be my colleagues. So thanks very much for listening and have a good day.